This is not a success story. This is the story of what survival took from her and what it gave back. Oprah Winfrey, the struggle behind the spotlight, where breaking is not an option. Before the world knew her name, before the cameras and the crowds, before the empire and the influence, there was a child born into the margins, a place where hope was rationed and dreams were a kind of defiance. Oprah Winfrey was born on January 29, 1954, in Kosciuszko, Mississippi. The world she entered was small, rural, and divided by lines that could not be crossed. The South was still deep in the grip of Jim Crow. Black children were born into a world that told them, from the first breath, how little they were supposed to matter. Her mother, Vernita Lee, was just a teenager, unmarried, working as a housemaid for white families. Her father, Vernon Winfrey, was a soldier stationed far away. Oprah's arrival was not celebrated with fanfare or comfort. She was born in a tiny house on a dirt road to a mother who could barely afford to feed herself, let alone a child. There was no nursery, no crib, no security. Just a baby girl wrapped in whatever rags could be found, and a world that seemed determined to keep her small. The house was more shack than home. The walls were thin, the winters cold, the summers suffocating. There was no running water, no electricity, no insulation from the world outside. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and poverty. The only constant was the sound of her grandmother, Hattie Mee, moving through the rooms, cooking, cleaning, praying, surviving. Hattie Mee became Oprah's first protector, her first teacher, her first example of what it meant to endure. She taught Oprah to read before she was 3, sitting her on the porch with the Bible, sounding out the words, letter by letter. In a world that wanted her silent, Hattie Mee gave her a voice. In a world that wanted her invisible, Hattie Mee made her seen. But the world outside their door was not kind. Oprah was a black child in Mississippi, and that meant she was always at risk. She learned early that her skin was a target, that her presence was a problem. She watched her grandmother bow her head and lower her eyes when white people passed. She learned to keep quiet, to stay out of the way, to make herself small. There was never enough food, never enough money, never enough safety. Oprah wore dresses made from potato sacks, her hair tied with scraps of cloth. She went barefoot in the summer, her feet toughened by the dirt and the heat. She learned to make do, to go without, to find joy in the smallest things, a story, a song, a moment of peace. But even in those early years, there was something in her that refused to be broken. She stood on the porch and recited Bible verses to the chickens, her voice loud and clear. She dreamed of something more, even when she didn't have the words for it. She watched the world and wondered why it was the way it was, why some people had everything and others had nothing, why some lives seemed to matter and others did not. This was not a childhood of innocence. It was a childhood of survival. Every day was a lesson in what it meant to be poor, to be black, to be female, to be unwanted. Every day was a reminder that the world could take everything from you except your will to keep going. Oprah's story did not begin with privilege or comfort. It began with struggle, with silence, with the kind of pain that leaves marks you can't see. It began in a place where hope was a dangerous thing, and yet, somehow, she found a way to hold on to it. This was the beginning. The world would try to keep her small, but even then, in the dirt and the darkness, something in her was already reaching for the light. There are chapters in a life that never truly end. They echo years later, in the quietest moments, in the way a person flinches at a sound, in the way they hold their breath when the world grows still. For Oprah, childhood was not just a time of poverty. It was a time of wounds that would shape every part of her, long after the bruises faded. After those first years in Mississippi, Oprah's life became a series of moves, each one a new beginning that never felt like a rescue. Her mother, Vernita, left for Milwaukee to find work, leaving Oprah in the care of her grandmother. When Vernita finally sent for her, Oprah was 6. She boarded a bus alone, clutching a suitcase filled with hand-me-downs and hope, and traveled north to a city she'd never seen, to a mother she barely knew. Milwaukee was not the escape she'd imagined. The apartment was cramped, the neighborhood rough, the air thick with the tension of people living too close and with too little. Vernita worked long hours as a maid, cleaning other people's homes, coming home exhausted and short-tempered. Oprah was often left alone, or in the care of relatives and family friends, adults who were supposed to protect her, but who instead became the source of her deepest pain. The abuse began quietly, as it so often does. She was 9 the first time it happened. A cousin, trusted by the family, came into her room at night. He told her to keep quiet, that no one would believe her, that it was her fault. The shame was immediate, suffocating. She did not tell. She could not tell. The silence became a second skin. It did not stop with him. Over the next several years, other men and uncle, a family friend, took what they wanted from her. Each time, the world grew smaller, darker. Each time, she learned a new way to disappear inside herself. She became an expert at silence, at pretending nothing was wrong, at carrying the weight of secrets too heavy for a child to bear. School was both a refuge and a battleground. Oprah was smart, so smart that teachers noticed, so smart that other kids resented her. She read everything she could find, escaping into books, into stories where girls like her could be safe, could be loved, could be anything at all. But even at school, the shame followed her. She was the poor girl, the girl with the wrong clothes, the girl who didn't fit in. She learned to perform, to make people laugh, to distract them from the things she could not say. At home, the silence was absolute. Her mother was overwhelmed, distracted, sometimes loving, sometimes cold. There was no room for Oprah's pain, no space for her voice. She tried once to tell an adult what was happening. She was met with disbelief, with anger, with the unspoken rule that some things were better left unsaid. She learned again to keep quiet. The trauma seeped into everything. She ate to fill the emptiness, to numb the pain. She acted out, rebelled, tried to find control in a world that offered her none. She ran away more than once, sleeping on porches, in abandoned houses, anywhere that felt safer than home. Each time she was brought back, and each time the walls around her heart grew higher. There were moments when it almost broke her. Nights when she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if it would ever end. Days when she looked in the mirror and saw only shame, only damage, only the things that had been done to her. She thought about ending it more than once. The pain was that deep, the silence that complete. But even in the darkest moments, something in her refused to give up. She found small ways to fight back, to speak up in class, to win spelling bees, to make people see her for something other than her pain. She learned to use her voice, even if only in whispers. She learned to survive, not just the world, but herself. The scars of those years would never fully heal. They would shape her relationships, her sense of self, her understanding of power and vulnerability. They would haunt her, drive her, push her to build a life where no one could ever silence her again. This was the crucible. This was the fire that forged her. Not the applause, not the fame, not the fortune, but the years when she was a child, alone and afraid, learning to survive in a world that refused to protect her. This was the pain that would one day become her power. But in those years, it was just pain and silence and the desperate, unending hope that one day she would be free. There are some secrets that live in the body long after they leave the mind. For Oprah, adolescence was not a time of innocence or discovery. It was a time of consequences, of carrying the weight of other people's choices, of trying to find herself in a world that had already taken so much. By the time she was 13, Oprah was already an expert at hiding. She hid her pain, her hunger, her fear. She hid the truth about what had been done to her, the shame that clung to her skin. She hid the loneliness that came from moving between homes, her mother's in Milwaukee, her father's in Nashville, back and forth, never truly belonging anywhere. Each move was a new set of rules, a new set of expectations, a new set of ways to fail. She was desperate for love, for approval, for any sign that she mattered. She found it sometimes in the wrong places. She was 14 when she discovered she was pregnant. The news was a shock, a secret she could barely admit to herself, let alone anyone else. She was terrified of her mother's anger, of her father's disappointment, of the world's judgment. She wore baggy clothes, avoided eye contact, tried to will the truth away. The pregnancy was not the result of love. It was the result of years of abuse, of a childhood spent learning that her body was not her own. But in those months, she carried the child in silence, the secret growing heavier with every day. She was still a child herself, and yet she was expected to bear the burden of adulthood, to pay the price for things she could not control. When her mother found out, the reaction was swift and brutal. Oprah was sent away, shamed, made to feel like a failure, a disappointment, a problem to be fixed. She was sent to live with her father in Nashville, a man who believed in discipline, in rules, in the power of education to save a life. He did not know how to talk about pain, about shame, about the things that had happened to his daughter. He only knew how to demand more, to expect better, to insist that she rise above. The baby was born prematurely, a boy. He lived only a few weeks. Oprah never held him, never named him, never spoke of him for years. The loss was a wound she carried in silence, a grief that had no place in the world she was trying to build. She told herself it was for the best, that she was too young, too broken, too lost to be a mother. But the pain was real, and it lingered. This was the moment where everything could have fallen apart. The shame, the loss, the sense of being unworthy, it could have swallowed her whole. She could have disappeared, become another statistic, another black girl lost to poverty and pain. But something in her refused to let go. She went back to school. She studied harder. She listened to her father's lectures, his warnings, his belief that education was the only way out. She learned to channel her pain into ambition, her shame into drive. She became the girl who always had her hand up in class, who read every book she could find, who refused to let anyone see how much she was hurting. She learned to perform, to charm, to win people over with her intelligence and her wit. She learned to survive, not just the world, but herself. But the loss of her child was a scar that never fully healed. It was a reminder of everything she had endured, everything she had lost, everything she had survived. It was a secret she carried for years, a pain she rarely spoke of, a chapter in her life that shaped everything that came after. Oprah Winfrey's story is not one of easy victories or simple redemption. It is a story of wounds that never fully close, of pain that becomes purpose, of a girl who learned to carry her own brokenness and still find a way to rise. The world would one day see her as a symbol of strength, of resilience, of hope. But in those years, she was just a girl, alone with her grief, trying to find a reason to keep going. There are children who disappear into the background, and there are children who, despite everything, find a way to be seen. Oprah was never invisible in the classroom, even when her home life was chaos. even when her heart was heavy with secrets. She was the girl who raised her hand, who read with a voice that filled the room, who made teachers pause and look twice. After the loss of her child, Oprah's life in Nashville with her father, Vernon, was strict, structured, and by necessity focused on survival through achievement. Vernon was not a man who coddled. He demanded excellence. He set curfews, checked homework, and made it clear that failure was not an option. For Oprah, this discipline was both a lifeline and a new kind of pressure. She was expected to be better, to do more, to prove herself every single day. But in the classroom, Oprah found something she had never known before: recognition. She was smart, and people noticed. She devoured books, classics, poetry, the Bible, anything she could get her hands on. She memorized passages, recited them with a preacher's cadence, and soon her teachers began to single her out. She won oratory contests, spelling bees, and reading competitions. She was invited to speak at church, at school assemblies, at local events. Her voice, so often silenced at home, became her power. There was a moment, standing in front of her class, reciting a poem, when she realized people were listening. Not just hearing, but truly listening. It was a feeling she had never known. The sense that her words mattered, that she could move people, that she could make them feel something. For a girl who had spent so much of her life unseen and unheard, it was intoxicating. But the recognition brought its own challenges. Other students resented her. She was called a teacher's pet, a know-it-all, a show-off. She learned to navigate jealousy, to hide her intelligence when it made her a target, to use humor and charm to win people over. She became a performer, adapting to whatever the room required, always aware of the line between being noticed and being resented. At home, Vernon pushed her harder. He made her read a book a week and write reports on each one. He quizzed her on current events, on history, on the world beyond their neighborhood. He told her over and over that education was her ticket out, her only chance to escape the cycle of poverty and pain. Oprah believed him. She clung to her studies like a lifeline, pouring her energy into school, into reading, into becoming someone who could not be ignored. There were still moments of doubt, moments when the old shame crept in, when the weight of her past threatened to pull her under. But in the classroom, with a book in her hand and an audience in front of her, she felt powerful. She felt possible. This was the beginning of her transformation, not just from victim to survivor, but from silence to voice. The world had tried to keep her small, to keep her quiet, to make her believe she was nothing. But in those classrooms, in those contests, in those moments when her words made people stop and listen, Oprah began to believe in something bigger. She began to believe in herself. It was not a rescue. It was not a cure, but it was a start. And for a girl who had survived so much, it was everything. There are moments in a life when the world cracks open just a little, and lets in a sliver of possibility. For Oprah, that moment came not with applause or fanfare, but with a microphone and a chance that would change everything. Even if she didn't know it yet, she was still a teenager, still living under Vernon's strict rules in Nashville, when she entered a local speaking contest. The prize was a scholarship to Tennessee State University, a historically black college. Oprah won, not just because she was smart, but because her voice, steady, resonant, unmistakably real, commanded attention. She enrolled at TSU, majoring in communications, and for the first time, she felt the world opening up in ways she had only imagined in books. It was at TSU that she got her first real taste of broadcasting. A local radio station, WVOL, was looking for part-time newsreaders. Oprah auditioned, her voice trembling with nerves, and was hired on the spot. She was 17, reading the news to a city that had no idea who she was or what she had survived. But behind the microphone, she felt powerful. She felt safe. The world could not touch her there. Radio was a revelation. She learned to modulate her voice, to tell stories, to connect with people she would never see. She learned the discipline of deadlines, the pressure of live broadcasting, the thrill of being heard. For the first time, her words were not just for teachers or classmates, they were for everyone. She was still the poor black girl from Mississippi, but on the air, she was something more. But radio was only the beginning. The local CBS television affiliate, WLAC-TV, took notice of the young woman with the unforgettable voice. They offered her a job as a part-time news anchor, the first black female anchor in Nashville's history. She was 19, barely out of high school, and suddenly she was sitting behind a desk, reading the news to an entire city. It was not easy. The newsroom was a world of men, white men, mostly, who looked at her with skepticism, sometimes with open hostility. She was too young, too inexperienced, too black, too female. She made mistakes. She stumbled over words. She felt the weight of every eye on her, waiting for her to fail. The pressure was suffocating, but she kept going. She learned to hold her own, to ask questions, to push back. She learned to hide her nerves, to project confidence she didn't always feel. She learned that being first meant being alone, and that being alone meant being strong. There were moments when the old doubts crept in, when she wondered if she belonged, if she was good enough, if she would ever be more than a token, a novelty, a girl who got lucky. But there were also moments of triumph. The first time a viewer called the station to praise her, the first time a colleague treated her as an equal, the first time she looked in the mirror and saw not a victim, but a professional. Oprah's entry into radio and television was not a fairy tale. It was a battle against prejudice, against self-doubt, against the ghosts of her past. But it was also a beginning. It was the first time she saw a future that was bigger than her pain. A future where her voice could change not just her own life, but the lives of others. She was still learning, still struggling, still surviving. But now, for the first time, she was also becoming. And the world, whether it was ready or not, was starting to listen. There are battles that never make the headlines. Wars fought in the quiet corners of offices and studios, in the glances that linger too long, in the words that cut without ever being spoken aloud. For Oprah, the world of media was not a promised land. It was a minefield, one where every step forward was met with resistance, and every mistake was magnified. She was barely 20, a Black woman in a newsroom that had never made space for someone like her. The men around her, producers, anchors, executives, wore their skepticism like armor. They called her the girl, dismissed her ideas, questioned her presence. She was too young, too emotional, too eager. She was told to smile more, to speak less, to remember her place. The racism was rarely overt, but it was everywhere. She saw it in the way stories were assigned, in the way her mistakes were cataloged, in the way her successes were minimized. She was given the soft stories, human interest, community events, anything that wouldn't ruffle feathers. Hard news, politics, anything that mattered was reserved for the men, for the white anchors who had always been the face of the station. She tried to fit in, to play by the rules, to be what they wanted. She straightened her hair, wore the clothes they suggested, softened her voice. But nothing was ever enough. She was too loud, too opinionated, too Black. She was told again and again that she was lucky to be there at all. The rejection was constant. She was passed over for promotions, left out of meetings, ignored in the newsroom. She watched as less talented, less driven colleagues moved ahead, their paths smoothed by privilege and connections she would never have. She learned to swallow her anger, to hide her frustration, to keep her head down and work twice as hard for half the recognition. But the pressure built. The more she tried to conform, the more she lost herself. She began to resent the job, the people, the industry that had once felt like a lifeline. She questioned her own worth, her own talent, her own right to dream. The old voices returned, the ones that told her she was not enough, that she would never belong, that she was destined to fail. There were moments when she almost walked away, when the weight of rejection, of invisibility, of being constantly underestimated became too much. She thought about quitting, about finding a safer path, about disappearing before the world could push her out. But something in her refused to give in. She remembered the little girl in Mississippi, the one who had survived so much, who had learned to fight for every scrap of dignity. She remembered the pain of silence, the cost of hiding, the power of her own voice. She decided, quietly, stubbornly, to stay. She began to push back, She pitched her own stories, fought for airtime, demanded to be heard. She stopped trying to be what they wanted and started being herself. She let her hair go natural, wore the clothes that made her feel strong, spoke with the passion that had always set her apart. She made mistakes, but she owned them. She failed, but she learned. The backlash was immediate. She was called difficult, unprofessional, a troublemaker. She was warned that she was risking her career, that she was making enemies, that she would never succeed if she didn't play by the rules. But for the first time, she didn't care. She found allies, other women, other outsiders, people who saw her not as a threat, but as a pioneer. She built a small circle of support, people who encouraged her, challenged her, reminded her of her worth. She began to see her difference not as a liability, but as a strength. But the cost was real. The rejection, the isolation, the constant pressure to prove herself, it wore her down. She struggled with depression, with self-doubt, with the fear that she would never escape the box the world had built for her. She worked long hours, sacrificed friendships, put her own needs last. She was driven, but she was also exhausted. This was not the glamorous rise of a star. This was survival day by day in a world that was not built for her. It was a test of endurance, of will, of the ability to keep going when everything in you wants to stop. Oprah's early years in media were not a triumph. They were a crucible, a place where she was broken down, reshaped, and forced to decide who she would become. Would she be what the world wanted, or would she risk everything to be herself? She chose the harder path. She chose to fight, and in doing so, she began to build the foundation for everything that would come after, not just a career, but a life defined by resilience, by defiance, by the refusal to be silent. This was the price of entry. This was the cost of being first, and it was only the beginning. There are moments in a life when the world seems to close in, when every step forward feels like a mistake, and the weight of every past wound presses down with new, suffocating force. For Oprah Winfrey, Chicago was that moment, a city that promised everything and nearly took it all away. It was 1983. Oprah was 29, already a survivor of more than most people could imagine. She had clawed her way out of rural Mississippi, out of abuse, out of poverty, out of the silence that had nearly swallowed her whole. She had made a name for herself in Baltimore, her voice and presence undeniable, her ability to connect with people almost supernatural. But Baltimore was not enough. She wanted more. She wanted to matter, to be seen, to prove that her pain and her talent could build something lasting. Chicago was the next step. WLS-TV, the ABC affiliate, had offered her a job hosting a low-rated morning talk show called AM Chicago. It was a risk. The city was bigger, wider, colder. The stakes were higher. The show was dying, and everyone knew it. The previous host had been fired. The ratings were abysmal. The producers were desperate. They wanted something new, something different, something that might save them from irrelevance. Oprah arrived in the dead of winter, the city gray and unwelcoming. She was not what Chicago expected. She was not what television expected. She was black. She was overweight. She was emotional. She was real. She was everything the industry had been trained to reject. The first days were brutal. The staff was skeptical, the audience indifferent. The city's media elite watched her with thinly veiled contempt. She was an outsider, a curiosity, a risk that would almost certainly fail. The pressure was immediate and relentless. Every morning, she woke before dawn, her stomach twisted with anxiety, her mind racing with doubts. She rehearsed her lines, studied her guests, tried to hide the fear that she was in over her head. The show was live. There was no safety net, no second take. Every mistake was broadcast, every hesitation magnified. The producers watched her with arms crossed, waiting for her to stumble. The audience, mostly white, mostly middle class, looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. She felt their eyes on her skin, on her body, on her every word. She tried to be herself. She tried to connect. She listened to her guests, asked real questions, let her emotions show. She cried on air. She laughed too loudly. She hugged people. She broke every rule of television decorum. And for a moment, it seemed to work. The ratings ticked up. The phone lines lit up. People started to talk, but the backlash was swift. The local press was merciless. They called her unprofessional, too emotional, too black, too fat. They mocked her hair, her clothes, her accent. They said she was a fluke, a novelty, a mistake. The station manager called her into his office and told her to lose weight, to tone it down, to be more like the women on the other channels. He told her in so many words that she was not what Chicago wanted. Oprah went home every night and cried. She called her best friend Gail, her voice shaking, her confidence shattered. "I don't belong here," she said. "They don't want me. I'm not good enough." The old voices came back, the voices of her childhood, of her abusers, of every person who had ever told her she was worthless. She stopped eating. She stopped sleeping. She started to believe them. The pressure built. The ratings plateaued. The stations started looking for replacements. The producers whispered behind her back. The audience numbers were not enough. The city was not enough. She was not enough. This was the moment where everything could have fallen apart. She thought about quitting. She thought about going back to Baltimore, to safety, to obscurity. She thought about disappearing, about letting the world win. She thought about all the people who had hurt her, all the people who had doubted her, all the people who had told her she would never make it. She thought about the little girl in Mississippi, the one who had survived so much, who had dreamed of something better. And then something shifted. Maybe it was anger. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the simple refusal to let the world break her again. She decided to fight. She decided to stay. She decided to be herself, no matter what it cost. She went back to the studio and told the producers she would not change. She would not lose weight for them. She would not hide her emotions. She would not pretend to be someone she was not. She would do the show her way, or not at all. The next morning, she walked onto the set with her head held high. She looked into the camera and spoke directly to the audience. She told the truth. She told her story. She let herself be seen, flaws and all. Something happened. The audience responded. The ratings climbed. The phone lines exploded. People saw themselves in her. They saw her pain, her vulnerability, her strength. They saw a woman who had survived, who had refused to be broken, who had turned her wounds into something powerful. The station took notice. The press took notice. The city took notice. Oprah Winfrey was not what Chicago expected. She was something better. She was real. But the scars remained. The fear, the doubt, the shame, they never fully left her. Every day was a battle. Every show was a test. Every success was shadowed by the memory of how close she had come to losing everything. Chicago did not break her, but it came close. It forced her to choose between safety and authenticity, between silence and voice, between survival and living. She chose herself. She chose to fight. She chose to become the woman the world would one day know. But in that winter, in that city, in that studio, Oprah Winfrey learned what it meant to stand on the edge of failure and refuse to fall. She learned what it meant to survive, not just the world, but herself. And nothing would ever be the same. There are moments when a person steps into a room and, without knowing it, changes the room forever. For Oprah, that room was a television studio in Chicago. The city was cold, the stakes were high, and the show she inherited, AM Chicago, was on life support. The producers were desperate, the ratings were abysmal, and the industry was watching, waiting for her to fail. She was not what anyone expected. She was not the polished, detached host with the perfect smile and the practiced distance. She was not white, not thin, not the kind of woman who had ever been given the keys to daytime television. She was, in every way, an outsider. And yet, from the first moment she sat in the host's chair, something shifted. Oprah did not interview her guests. She listened to them. She did not perform empathy, she lived it. She asked questions that cut through the surface, that made people cry, that made them confess things they had never said out loud. She was not afraid of pain or mess or the rawness of real life. She brought her own wounds to the table, and in doing so, gave others permission to do the same. The show changed almost overnight. The ratings climbed. The phone lines lit up. People saw themselves in her guests, in the stories that were suddenly being told on daytime TV. The topics were not always comfortable: addiction, abuse, racism, shame. But Oprah did not flinch. She leaned in. She made the pain visible, and in doing so, made it bearable. The industry took notice. The format was copied, the style imitated, but no one could replicate what Oprah brought to the screen. She was not just a host, she was a witness, a confessor, a mirror. She made people feel seen, and in a world that so often ignored the broken and the hurting, that was revolutionary. But the success came with a cost. The more the show grew, the more the pressure mounted. The network wanted bigger ratings, more sensational stories, more spectacle. There were producers who pushed for tabloid drama, for conflict, for the kind of television that got people talking for all the wrong reasons. Oprah resisted. She fought for integrity, for meaning, for the kind of show that could change lives, not just fill airtime. There were battles behind the scenes, fights over content, over guests, over the soul of the show. Oprah was accused of being difficult, of caring too much, of refusing to play the game. She lost friends, made enemies, burned bridges. But she refused to compromise. She knew what it was like to be voiceless, to be invisible, to be reduced to a headline or a stereotype. She would not do that to anyone else. The show became a phenomenon. AM Chicago was renamed the Oprah Winfrey Show, and with that, she became not just a host, but a brand, a force, a cultural event. The audience grew, the accolades poured in, the money followed. But the work was never easy. Every day was a negotiation between what the world wanted and what she believed was right, between the demands of fame and the needs of her own soul. There were moments when it almost broke her. The pressure, the scrutiny, the endless need to be everything to everyone. She struggled with exhaustion, with self-doubt, with the fear that it could all disappear in an instant. She watched as other shows copied her format, as the industry shifted around her, as the world tried to turn her into something she was not. But she held on. She kept showing up. She kept telling the truth, even when it hurt. She kept making space for the stories that mattered, for the people who had never been given a voice. She turned daytime television into something it had never been: a place for healing, for honesty, for transformation. Oprah did not just reinvent talk television. She reinvented what it meant to be seen, to be heard, to matter. She took the pain of her own life and turned it into a platform for others. She made the personal public, the private universal. She changed the room, and in doing so, changed the world. But the cost was real. The work was never finished, and the pressure, the responsibility, the weight of being Oprah, those things would only grow heavier with time. Fame is a kind of hunger. It devours privacy, warps reality, and leaves a person exposed in ways they never imagined. For Oprah, the rise was meteoric. The Oprah Winfrey Show was not just a hit. It was a cultural earthquake. Suddenly, she was everywhere, on billboards, in magazines, on the lips of millions. She was no longer just a woman with a story. She was a symbol, a brand, a phenomenon. And the world wanted more. But behind the applause, the interviews, the standing ovations, there was a different story, a story of exhaustion, of fear, of a woman struggling to hold on to herself as the world tried to claim her. The days blurred together. The show was a machine, demanding more and more guests, more revelations, more emotion, more spectacle. Oprah's face was on every screen, her name in every headline. She was praised for her empathy, her candor, her ability to make people feel seen. But the price of being seen was being watched, always, everywhere, by everyone. She could not go to the grocery store without being mobbed. She could not eat in a restaurant without whispers, stares, requests for autographs. Strangers felt entitled to her time, her story, her body. They told her their secrets, their pain, their dreams, as if she belonged to them. And in a way, she did. She had built her career on connection, on intimacy, on the promise that she was just like everyone else. But now, she was not. She was Oprah. And Oprah was not allowed to be ordinary. The pressure was relentless. Every episode was a test, every interview a risk. The ratings had to stay high. The stories had to be bigger, more shocking, more raw. Producers pushed for more pain, more confession, more spectacle. Oprah fought to keep the show honest, to protect her guests, to protect herself. But the line between authenticity and performance grew thin. She began to wonder where the show ended, and she began. There were days when she felt like a fraud, days when she smiled for the cameras, and then cried alone in her dressing room. Days when the applause felt hollow, when the praise felt like a trap. She was surrounded by people, but she had never felt more alone. The world saw her as strong, unbreakable, a beacon of hope. But inside, she was tired. She was scared. She was losing herself. The money, the fame, the power, they were supposed to make it easier. But they only made it harder. Every decision was scrutinized. Every mistake was magnified. Every rumor, every headline, every whisper became a weight she had to carry. She was accused of being too powerful, too rich, too ambitious. She was accused of selling out, of exploiting pain, of caring too much, of not caring enough. She could not win. Her body became a battleground. The tabloids obsessed over her weight, her hair, her clothes. They called her fat, ugly, unlovable. They dissected her relationships, her friendships, her choices. She tried to ignore it, to rise above it, but the words cut deep. The old wounds reopened. The shame returned. She worked harder. She gave more. She tried to be everything to everyone. But the more she gave, the less she had left for herself. She stopped sleeping. She stopped eating. She stopped feeling. She became a machine, a product, a brand. She lost touch with her friends, with her family, with the parts of herself that were not for public consumption. There were moments when she thought about walking away, moments when the pain was too much, when the loneliness was too sharp, when the cost of being Oprah felt too high. She wondered if she could ever go back to the girl who read on the porch in Mississippi, back to the woman who found her voice in a Nashville radio booth, back to a life that was her own. But there was no going back. The world would not let her. She had become something bigger than herself, something she could not control. She was a symbol, a savior, a target. She was Oprah. This was the moment where everything could have fallen apart. The fame, the pressure, the loss of self, it could have destroyed her. It almost did. But even as she stood on the edge, looking into the abyss, something in her refused to let go. She remembered the pain, the silence, the struggle. She remembered what it meant to survive. But survival was not the same as living. And in those years, at the height of her fame, Oprah Winfrey was surviving. Barely. There are wounds that never fully close. And for Oprah, the wounds of childhood, poverty, abuse, shame never truly left her. They lived in her body, in her mind, in the way she saw herself in the mirror, and in the way she moved through the world. Fame had given her power, but it had also given her a new kind of scrutiny, a new kind of pain. The world watched her, judged her, measured her worth in pounds and inches and headlines. The battle with her body was relentless. From the earliest days of her career, Oprah's weight was a public obsession. Tabloids ran cruel stories, dissecting every fluctuation, every diet, every failure. Producers and executives made suggestions, subtle, sometimes not so subtle, about how she should look, what she should wear, how she should present herself. She was told again and again that her body was a problem to be solved, a flaw to be fixed. She tried everything: diets, exercise, fasting, pills. She lost weight, gained it back, lost it again. Each time the world watched, waiting for her to fail. Each time the shame grew heavier. She stood on stage and confessed her struggles, hoping that honesty would set her free. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it only made the pain sharper. But the battle was never just about food. It was about control, about worth, about the old belief that she was not enough. The more successful she became, the more the old voices whispered, "You're still that poor girl from Mississippi. You're still the girl who was hurt, who was used, who was never safe." No amount of money, no amount of fame could silence them. The pressure built. The show demanded more. The world demanded more. Oprah gave everything she had, but inside, she was unraveling. She struggled with depression, with anxiety, with the crushing weight of expectation. She went to therapy, searching for answers, for relief, for a way to make peace with herself. She read every self-help book she could find, interviewed experts on her show, tried to turn her pain into purpose. There were moments of hope, moments when she felt strong, when she felt beautiful, when she believed she could change not just her own life, but the lives of others. She started to talk openly about mental health, about shame, about the lies we tell ourselves. She invited guests onto her show to share their struggles, their secrets, their pain. She made it safe to talk about the things that had always been hidden. But the struggle never really ended. There were days when she woke up and could not face the world, days when she looked in the mirror and saw only failure, days when the old shame threatened to swallow her whole. She kept going because she had to, because the world expected her to, because she did not know how to stop. The cost was high. Relationships suffered. Friendships faded. She became more isolated, more guarded, more alone. The show was her refuge, her therapy, her way of making sense of the chaos inside. But even there, she was never fully safe. The cameras were always rolling. The world was always watching. This was not the story the world wanted to hear. They wanted triumph, transformation, a happy ending. But Oprah's truth was messier, harder, more human. She was a woman at war with herself, fighting every day to believe that she was enough, that she was worthy, that she could be loved. She did not always win, but she never stopped fighting. And in that fight, she gave millions of others permission to fight too, to speak their truth, to face their pain, to believe, even for a moment, that healing was possible. Oprah's battle with her body, her mind, her self-image was never just about her. It was about all of us, the parts we hide, the wounds we carry, the hope that we can be more than what the world tells us we are. It was a battle she would fight for the rest of her life, but in fighting it, she changed the world. There is a myth that success brings safety, that once you reach the top, the world can no longer touch you. But for Oprah, the summit was never a place to rest. It was a place to risk everything again. By the late 2000s, Oprah Winfrey was more than a talk show host. She was an institution, a billionaire, a cultural force. She could have stayed there in the comfort of her empire, letting the machine she'd built run on autopilot. But comfort had never been her home. She wanted more. She wanted to create something that would outlast her, something that would give others the power to tell their own stories. She wanted to build a network, a place where voices like hers, voices that had been silenced and ignored, could finally be heard. The idea was bold. The risk was enormous. The Oprah Winfrey Network, OWN, would be her legacy, her next act, her greatest gamble. She poured her money, her reputation, her very identity into it. She left the safety of her show, the routine that had defined her for decades, and stepped into the unknown. From the beginning, nothing went as planned. The launch was rocky. The ratings were disappointing. The critics circled, waiting for her to fail. The media, once eager to praise her, now questioned her judgment, her relevance, her ability to lead. The headlines were brutal. Oprah's network flounders. Is this the end of Oprah's reign? The world that had once cheered her on now seemed to relish the possibility of her collapse. Behind the scenes, the pressure was suffocating. Oprah was used to being in control, to trusting her instincts, to making decisions that turned to gold. But television was changing. The audience was changing. The rules were different. She was no longer the underdog. She was the establishment, and the world was eager to see her stumble. She worked harder than ever, throwing herself into every detail: programming, marketing, hiring, firing. She was in meetings from dawn until midnight, her phone always buzzing, her mind always racing. She second-guessed herself, doubted her choices, wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. The old fears returned. What if I'm not enough? What if I lose everything? What if the world was right about me all along? The failures were public and painful. Shows were canceled. Executives were replaced. Millions of dollars were lost. Oprah's name, once synonymous with success, became a punchline in boardrooms and newsrooms. She felt the sting of betrayal, the loneliness of leadership, the terror of watching everything she had built begin to crumble. But she refused to give up. She remembered the girl who had survived Mississippi, the teenager who had survived abuse and loss, the woman who had survived the glare of fame. She knew how to fight. She knew how to rebuild. She knew that failure was not the end, but the beginning of something new. She listened. She learned. She changed course. She brought in new partners, new ideas, new energy. She focused on what mattered: authentic stories, real voices, the kind of programming that had always set her apart. Slowly, painfully, OWN began to find its footing. The ratings improved. The critics quieted. The network became a home for shows that mattered, for conversations that changed lives. But the cost was real. Oprah was exhausted, battered, changed. She had risked everything: her money, her reputation, her sense of self. She had faced the possibility of failure on a scale she had never known. She had learned again that survival was not about never falling, but about getting up over and over, no matter how hard the world tried to keep her down. Building OWN was not a victory lap. It was a crucible, a test of faith, of resilience, of the willingness to risk everything for a dream. Oprah did not emerge unscathed, but she emerged, and in doing so, she proved again that her power was not in her perfection, but in her refusal to quit. This was not the story the world wanted. It was not easy or pretty or triumphant. It was real. It was hard. It was earned. And it was hers. Power is a double-edged sword. It can open doors, but it can also turn every misstep into a spectacle. For Oprah, power was never just about influence or wealth. It was about the responsibility to use her voice, to lift others, to do good in a world that had had so often done her wrong. But the higher she climbed, the more the world watched, and the more it waited for her to fall. By the time OWN found its footing, Oprah was no longer just a media figure. She was a cultural institution, a billionaire, a philanthropist, a kingmaker. Her book club could turn unknown authors into bestsellers overnight. Her endorsement could swing elections, move markets, change lives. She was invited to the White House, to royal weddings, to the most exclusive rooms in the world. She was, in every sense, powerful. But power came with a price. Every decision was scrutinized. Every word was dissected. Every friendship, every partnership, every business move was a headline. The world that had once cheered her rise now questioned her motives, her authenticity, her right to lead. She was accused of being too political, too commercial, too self-righteous, too soft, too hard. She was called a savior and a sellout, a role model and a fraud. The criticism was relentless. When she spoke out on issues of race, gender, or justice, she was told to stay in her lane. When she stayed silent, she was accused of not caring enough. When she gave away cars, built schools, funded scholarships, she was accused of doing it for attention, for ratings, for ego. There was no way to win. The pressure was suffocating. Oprah had always carried the weight of expectation, but now it was heavier than ever. She was expected to be perfect, to have all the answers, to never make a mistake. She was expected to be a voice for the voiceless, a champion for the marginalized, a beacon of hope for millions. But she was also expected to be humble, to be grateful, to never forget where she came from. She tried to live up to it. She tried to be everything to everyone. She worked harder, gave more, listened more, learned more. She surrounded herself with advisors, with friends, with people who would tell her the truth. She tried to stay grounded, to remember the girl from Mississippi, the pain, the struggle, the silence. She tried to use her power for good, to make a difference, to leave the world better than she found it. But the criticism never stopped. It came from all sides: fans, detractors, the media, even people she thought were friends. It was personal, it was political, it was racial, it was sexist. It was about her body, her money, her choices, her very existence. It was a reminder that no matter how far she had come, there were still people who wanted to see her fail. There were moments when it almost broke her. Moments when the loneliness of leadership was too much to bear. Moments when she questioned whether it was worth it, whether she could keep going, whether she could keep carrying the weight of so many expectations. But she kept going. She kept showing up. She kept using her voice, her platform, her power. She made mistakes, and she owned them. She learned from her failures, from her critics, from her own pain. She refused to be silent, to be small, to be less than what she was. Oprah's power was never just about her. It was about what she could do for others, about the doors she could open, about the lives she could change. But it was also about survival, about refusing to let the world define her, about refusing to let the criticism win. This was not the story of a perfect leader. It was the story of a woman who carried the weight of the world, who stumbled, who fell, who got back up. It was the story of power earned, power tested, power used for something bigger than herself. And it was a story that was far from over. There are wounds that no amount of money, fame, or power can heal. For Oprah, the journey inward was the hardest of all. She had survived poverty, abuse, rejection, and the relentless gaze of the world. She had built an empire, changed the face of television, and become a symbol of hope for millions. But inside, the old pain lingered quiet, persistent, unresolved. The world saw her as strong, unbreakable, almost superhuman. But Oprah knew the truth. She was still the girl from Mississippi, still the teenager who had been hurt and silenced, still the woman who sometimes looked in the mirror and saw only her scars. The applause faded. The headlines changed. The crowds went home. And in the silence, she was left with herself. It was in this silence that Oprah began to search for something deeper. She read voraciously books on spirituality, psychology, healing. She interviewed spiritual leaders, therapists, survivors. She asked the questions she had always been afraid to ask. Why am I here? What does it mean to be whole? How do I forgive? How do I let go? She began to meditate, to pray, to sit with her pain instead of running from it. She learned to listen to her own voice, to trust her intuition, to honor the parts of herself that had been hidden for so long. She sought out teachers, Maya Angelou, Eckhart Tolle, Deepak Chopra, people who could help her make sense of her journey, who could show her that healing was possible, even after everything. There were no easy answers. The process was slow, uncomfortable, sometimes excruciating. She confronted the trauma of her childhood, the shame of her past, the fear that she would never be enough. She learned to forgive, not just those who had hurt her, but herself. She learned that survival was not the same as living, that true healing required honesty, vulnerability, and the willingness to feel everything she had spent a lifetime avoiding. Oprah began to share this journey with her audience. She created Super Soul Sunday, a space for conversations about meaning, purpose, and the soul. She invited guests to talk about their own struggles, their own awakenings, their own paths to healing. She made it safe to talk about the things that had always been hidden: addiction, depression, grief, forgiveness. She showed the world that strength was not about never breaking, but about learning how to put yourself back together. The more she healed, the more she changed. She became softer, more compassionate, more present. She learned to set boundaries, to say no, to protect her energy. She let go of relationships that no longer served her, of roles that no longer fit. She found joy in the small things, in a sunrise, in a quiet moment, in the laughter of friends. But healing was not a destination. It was a practice, a daily choice, a commitment to herself. There were setbacks, relapses, days when the old pain returned. But she kept going. She kept searching. She kept believing that wholeness was possible. This was not the story the world wanted from her. They wanted triumph, perfection, a happy ending. But Oprah's truth was messier, more human, more real. She was a woman who had been broken, who had learned to heal, who had found meaning in the struggle. Her spiritual awakening did not erase her pain. It transformed it. It gave her the strength to keep going, the wisdom to help others, the peace to finally, truly be herself. And in that, she found something she had been searching for her entire life, not just survival, but freedom. Legacy is not built in a single moment. It is shaped in the quiet aftermath of struggle, in the choices made when no one is watching, in the lives touched by a story that refuses to be silenced. For Oprah, legacy was never about the numbers, ratings, dollars, magazine covers. It was about the impact, the ripple effect, the way her pain and her triumphs could open doors for others. By the time she reached her 60s, Oprah Winfrey was more than a media mogul. She was a living symbol of what was possible, and also of what it cost. She had built schools in South Africa, funded scholarships for thousands, and used her platform to launch the careers of writers, actors, and activists who might otherwise have gone unheard. She had changed the way America talked about trauma, about race, about forgiveness, about what it means to be seen. But legacy is not just about what you give. It's about what you leave behind in the hearts of others. Oprah's influence was everywhere, on the bookshelves of millions, in the language of self-help and self-acceptance, in the quiet courage of people who saw themselves in her story and dared to hope for more. She had made it possible for Black women to dream bigger, for survivors to speak out, for the world to see vulnerability as a kind of strength. Yet, the weight of legacy was heavy. She felt it in every letter from a viewer who said her show had saved their life, in every young woman who looked to her for guidance, in every critic who questioned her motives or her methods. She knew that her story was not just her own. It belonged to everyone who had ever felt invisible, broken, or unworthy. There were moments of pride, standing in the school she built for girls who reminded her of herself, watching a former guest find healing, seeing her name become shorthand for possibility. But there were also moments of doubt. Had she done enough? Had she used her power wisely? Had she truly changed anything? Or had she just become another part of the machine? She wrestled with these questions, sometimes in public, often in private. She knew that legacy was not a guarantee. It could be rewritten, forgotten, misunderstood. She saw how quickly the world moved on, how easily stories were twisted, how even the greatest achievements could be reduced to a headline or a soundbite. But But she also knew that real legacy was not about being remembered. It was about making a difference, even if only for one person. It was about telling the truth, even when it hurt. It was about surviving and then reaching back to pull someone else out of the darkness. Oprah redefined success not as perfection, but as persistence. Not as applause, but as impact. Not as being above the world, but as being deeply, vulnerably, unforgettably human. She taught millions that it was possible to rise, to heal, to lead, even when the world said you couldn't. Her legacy was not a monument. It was a movement, a living, breathing testament to the power of survival, of voice, of hope. It was a reminder that strength is not born from comfort, but from pain no one sees. And as she looked back on her life, Oprah understood. The real measure of success was not in what she had built, but in what she had survived, and in the doors she had opened for those who would come after her. There is a price for survival that no one sees. It is not paid in dollars or headlines, but in the quiet, private moments when the world is not watching. For Oprah, the cost of survival was never just the pain she endured, but the parts of herself she had to leave behind to keep moving forward. The world saw the triumphs, the show, the network, the magazine, the schools, the billions. They saw the laughter, the wisdom, the generosity. They saw a woman who had turned her wounds into power, who had made her pain into a platform. But they did not see the nights when she could not sleep, the relationships that faltered under the weight of her ambition, the loneliness that crept in when the applause faded. Survival had taught her to be strong, to be vigilant, to never let her guard down. It had taught her to anticipate disappointment, to expect betrayal, to trust only a few. It had made her a fortress, even as she built a career on vulnerability. She learned to keep secrets, to hold her own pain close, to give the world only what she chose to share. The rest, the fear, the doubt, the exhaustion, she carried alone. There were friendships that could not survive the distance her success created. There were family members who saw her as a lifeline, a savior, a source of rescue she could never fully provide. There were lovers who could not understand the demands of her life, the way her past shaped her present, the way her work was both a calling and a shield. There were moments when she wondered if she would ever truly belong to anyone, or if the cost of being Oprah was to always be a little bit apart. She had learned to perform, to charm, to win people over, but there were days when she longed for the safety of invisibility, for the freedom to be ordinary, for the comfort of not being needed by so many. She missed the girl who read on the porch in Mississippi, the girl who dreamed without knowing what the world would demand in return. The trauma of her childhood never fully left her. It lived in her body, in her dreams, in the way she moved through the world. She had learned to turn pain into purpose, but the pain was still there. She had learned to forgive, but the memories lingered. She had learned to heal, but healing was never complete. There were moments of joy, real, deep, earned. There was pride in what she had built, in the lives she had changed, in the legacy she would leave behind. But there was also grief for what she had lost. The innocence stolen, the years spent in silence, the parts of herself she could never reclaim. Oprah Winfrey's story is not one of easy redemption. It is a story of survival, of resilience, of the relentless, exhausting work of becoming whole. It is a story of a woman who refused to be defined by her wounds, but who could never fully escape them. It is a story of strength forged in pain, of hope born from despair, of a life lived in the space between what was lost and what was possible. In the end, survival did not make her invincible. It made her real. It made her human. It made her someone who could look at the world's brokenness and say, I know, I've been there, and I'm still here. That is what survival really cost her. The comfort of forgetting, the ease of belonging, the safety of silence. But it also gave her something rare, a voice that could not be silenced, a legacy that could not be erased, and a life that, for all its pain, was truly, deeply her own.